Hello, everybody. My name is Stephen Woods. Here's my information. I work in a Yahoo platform group doing JavaScript frameworks that are used internally, which means my entire life is creating APIs. So documenting APIs has become a really tragically big part of my job. So I feel like I have a lot of strong opinions on this, and hopefully today I'll share some of that wisdom with you. So if you haven't yet, sometime in your life you will have to write APIs that other developers are expected to consume. So if you're anything like me, the last thing you want to do is write docs. It's totally boring. It takes forever. It's not fun. It's not what you got into writing code in the first place for. But unfortunately, or fortunately, undocumented code is so much worse than writing documentation that you'll be glad you did it. Now, the common response to this is that I don't need to document my code, right? My code is so easy to read. No one needs to have documentation for it, which is great if you're just writing code. If you're writing APIs, you should not expect people to open your code up, figure out what it does, and then use it. If you're writing APIs, you have to have good documentation. It's not an option. In fact, if you forget to do it, you'll end up with a situation like I found myself in over the last year or so, where people come and ask you questions that you probably should have put in the documentation. You think? Yeah, that's me. I said that. I admit it. I found it in my IM logs. Yeah, I think that might be part of the problem, that the documentation is not correct. If writing good documentation isn't, if the it's good argument isn't enough for you, how about self-preservation being a good reason to do it? If you don't want to spend your entire day talking to an IM, explaining how what you wrote works, you should write good docs. So let's talk about how to write good documentation. Now, if you ever encounter any API out there, maybe Rails, or maybe you hate yourself and you've been developing Windows software, or maybe you love yourself and you've been writing with YUI, regardless, you've found that there's incredibly complete API documentation. Every method, every property is documented and covered. And you might wonder how exactly they did that. My theory before I got into doing it myself was that people did it using some sort of army of highly trained technical writers. And the YUI library does not have this army yet, but I think they're working on it. Previous to this was my system of documentation. It worked incredibly well. I could keep my documentation totally in sync. I never had any trouble. People were always very happy to read it. No problem at all. So when I had some of the problems that I've outlined here, my solution was sort of policy. Okay, I'll write a document that says, this is how you write documentation. Okay, I'll make a checklist that helps you write documentation. None of that stuff really works, because ultimately everyone's just going to ignore it. What I really want to have, and this was my dream for a long time, and I didn't realize that their dream had been answered, is I want to write code, and I want to have docs. That's it. That's what I want. I don't want to have to make docs. So ideally, there's some sort of magic box that will make my code writing turn into doc having. So today we're going to talk about the magic. Now, the magic exists in a lot of forms. These are all different magical tools that generate documentation for you. Generating documentation makes your life so much easier. Once you start doing it, you'll wonder why you didn't do it before. And then you'll find yourself hopefully getting in the habit of writing the comments that can be generated from all the time. So what a doc generator does, if you don't know about it, is it takes your code and makes documentation from it. It doesn't, it's not a template, it's not a format, it's not anything. It literally takes your code, makes the documentation, everything else is done. Now, so there's varying degrees of smartness in these tools. PHP Documenter, you don't even have to write comments. It will write code. It will write documentation for you. It won't be very usable, but it will do it. YUI Doc is a little less intelligent, which has its benefits and downsides. I think the benefits outweigh the downsides, especially when you're using JavaScript. What YUI Doc does is it takes these comment blocks right here, and that's it, and makes beautiful documentation from them automatically. So YUI Doc is a language-neutral way to automatically generate beautiful documentation. Automatically is a word, please. Okay. So what does language neutral mean? Like I said, it only reads the comments. So whatever language you want to write in YUI Doc, you could actually use it for it, because it doesn't care. It always works. In fact, YUI Doc itself is written in Python, and it's documented using YUI Doc. Now, we all love JavaScript the best because it's the best language. So I'm going to focus on JavaScript in this talk. So what it means is we generate from special comment blocks. It doesn't read the code. It does a little bit. Adam, who wrote this, wanted me to mention it does read it a little bit. But for all intents and purposes, it generates it from comment blocks. So it can work with any language. And the most important thing for JavaScript is you can describe the code in whatever way makes sense for your context. Because with JavaScript, we can be very, very creative for how we build our applications and our object models. We don't have to really follow a interface, class, subclass approach. So with a language-neutral documentation approach, you can describe what you think people should understand it to do rather than try and write your code to meet that view. Now, there is a competitive tool, YUI Doc, which does try to read the code, and in my opinion is limiting because you have to stick to a way that it can read. Now, it's not that painful, but I would rather just not have to worry about that. I'd rather be able to describe what my code does, regardless of how I've decided to lay it out. So there's some downsides to language neutral. Your code is going to fall out of sync. I guarantee it. It's inevitable. It's better than it was if you're writing separate documentation. We're going to talk about ways to solve this later. You're going to copy and paste. Maybe people will tell you don't copy and paste your methods into descriptions. You're going to make mistakes copying and pasting. So it will happen. And type mismatches will happen. And I'll talk a little bit more about why type is so important in JavaScript documentation. Unfortunately, this is one place where documentation almost always gets out of sync. So what do I mean when I say beautiful documentation? Now, we all know what beautiful code is, or hopefully we do. We look at it, it's elegant, it's beautiful, it's clear, the solutions are simple. It just is almost self-apparent that it's beautiful. I think documentation can have this. It's a little less exciting to see beautiful documentation, probably. But the most important thing in my mind that makes it beautiful is that it's accurate. When I read the docs, they say what is actually going to happen when I call that method. It really is correct. It's complete. There's no, that method, yeah, that's not in the documentation, but it's really useful. It's complete documentation. And usable, that's really important. If people can't find your documentation or get to the method, they're not going to be able to use it. And YUI Doc, I think, is particularly well suited to this, mostly because of the magical autocomplete. And understandable. Now, I didn't have this on the slide before, and my colleague Chris Kleiber told me I should put this on here. You can have documentation, you can write documentation, but it can still make no sense. Unfortunately, we can't automate writing sensible documentation, but I would hope that you know enough that when you're writing a comment, if you've ever done UI design before, it's the same idea. Think about your users, think about their needs, and try and meet those needs. Your users are the people calling your API documentation. So they need to be able to understand what it does. So when you're writing your docs, instead of thinking, oh, what I did here was implement this algorithm, think instead, what does your user need to know about that method? How do I explain that to them? So using YUI Doc, which is the whole point of this talk in the first place, YUI Doc is really pretty simple to use, and it also is very, very powerful. I'm going to walk through a very simple sample project. In fact, you can download it right here if you want to check it out. I have a directory, my project. I have two modules, and we'll talk about that in a second, which in this case are directories, compression, and widgets. Don't worry about, I don't know if this code actually even works, so don't worry too much about that. What this translates to in the YUI Doc world is a layout something like this. You have your project. You have your modules, and unfortunately module is the world's most overloaded term. In this sense, we think of modules as a piece of our code. In the YUI world, it's anim, DOM, event, loader, those kind of overarching pieces. It can mean whatever you need it to mean. And then modules have classes. I'll talk a little bit more about what I think about those later. Now, like I said before, we describe those using comment blocks. Really simple syntax. There's a description for every comment block. Then there's tags and secondary tags. Each block can only have one tag, but it can have however many number of secondary tags. These are the primary tags. I don't expect you to remember this all right now. But you'll have to look at the docs for YUI Doc later. Now, there's a huge list of secondary tags, and obviously I have no time to go into the detail here. I'm going to talk a little bit about param and return because I think those are particularly important. But as you can see, there's a lot here, which gives you the power to really describe what's going on. The whole goal here is to be able to create API documentation that people can count on to describe exactly what's going on. And that's why we have so many options in YUI Doc. Now, you notice there's a little magic star here on attribute. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but if you saw some of my colleagues' talks about using widgets and attributes in YUI 3, this is a special feature in YUI Doc that allows you to do some automatic stuff with that. So why do I think these are the most important? Because of data types. When you're calling an API, you have return values and params. The type that is expected and returned is really, really important because it can confuse and infuriate you if an API doesn't do what you expect it to do. Fortunately or unfortunately, JavaScript does not have any kind of type hinting, any kind of, you can't say this method, you can't define that this method requires a type. But you often create a method that does require a certain type, a string, a number, an object, whatever. So in the documentation, you need to tell people what type you're going to give them and what type you expect. Now, the beauty of JavaScript is it's quite descriptive language. Type can mean a lot of different things. So we don't check that and make sure that you follow our list of approved types. Whatever you want your types to say, they can be. I would recommend you be consistent. But my type, for example, maybe you have created a special object interface that you expect to always receive for this method. Config objects are a really common use case for this. So let's talk about modules. The world's, again, most overloaded term. In this case, a module is sort of an overarching piece of a library that you've created. It may be, so in my case, it's compression, for example. I have this compression module, and I have a submodule that just does LZW compression. Compression LZW. So you can see I have each block has a tag, has a subtag, and then those subtags take parameters. Now, submodule, I'll show you what happens with that. Now, this doesn't quite match that code, actually, but you see what happens is it shows on the documentation where the submodule is. It shows you what classes are inside of this module. Now, what do we mean when we say class? We don't mean anything, right? Because it's JavaScript, there is no such thing as a class. I tend to look at a class as anything that's an object that has methods and properties on it that people need to know about. That's what I usually, if I'm writing documentation, that's what I refer to as a class. The reason being that most people, in my experience, most users of the documentation see it the same way. They see a class as an object. So when I'm writing documentation, again, I'm trying to think of what the user is expecting, where they're coming from. Most users have at least experienced classes. They know what they mean. So saying this is an object that may be a constructor or whatever, but it's an object that has methods I can call on it. So you see I've used the constructor tag here because in this case, this class can be instantiated with new. And it extends widget. The result is pretty descriptive. You can see the constructor here. You see it takes no parameters. You see the methods. You show the return value, which is void. Very informative about what people need to know. Now people know exactly how to use this time picker widget, which is the whole point of this exercise. Now, events. We do a lot of events in JavaScript, especially when we're doing client-side applications. So APIs have a tendency to fire events, consume events. And in YUI 3, we don't even have to describe those events before we fire them. So oftentimes, you will end up documenting something that doesn't even really exist in the code. There may be a line somewhere that it says fire this. But it isn't instantiated or created at any point. So I often use events in the way that I'll just put my events in a certain section of my code document so I can, when I'm looking at the code, see what events are being handled. And when other people are trying to consume the code, they can see these events. And again, you see how important it is that type is described here. And this turns out looking pretty nice. We understand how to handle the dawn event. Now properties, hopefully don't have to explain too much what a property is. But obviously, you can see the syntax is a little different because property is a major tag. So we have to create a subtag for type for properties. But again, the type matters. And you get this really beautiful thing. Now what I was talking about before, the magic from YUI 3. So my time picker uses attribute provider. It does cool stuff with attribute because it's a widget. So I know that there's automatically generated some events when attributes are changed. So I've documented it this way. I say there's a property called attributes, and the attribute time type object and has this default value. In result, event is documented automatically because that event is there, but I didn't have to actually tell YUI Doc that event was there. It's useful, but only useful if you're doing YUI, so obviously you won't want to use this otherwise. Now the meat of API documentation is methods, because APIs, when we're talking about APIs, we're talking about calling methods on an API. That's the number one interaction. So if anything is the most important in your documentation, it's that the method documentation is accurate, complete, and reliable. So I have this weird method that tells you the string size, takes a string, returns a number. Pretty important people know that this is probably not going to work too great if you try and get the string length of an array or an object. And it comes out beautiful. Now people can look at the documentation, understand what's going on, and use it. So you've written your code. It's really beautiful. It's easy to use. How do you build it? It's so easy that I'm just going to point you to the documentation online. Actually, if you want to take that down, bit.ly YUI Doc. So in more detail, what happens? It's a Python script. It's run from the command line. It looks pretty. It can be pretty gnarly if you don't spend a lot of time in the command line. If you want to understand it more, there is a -h, which will show you all the different options. But most people, and this is the real power for having a command line tool rather than a executable that just runs, you integrate it into your build. And if you download YUI Doc now, you're going to get this example build script, which is just a simple shell script. You set up some of these values. Pretty straightforward. Now, if you use this right now out of the box, you're going to have a problem, and then the documentation is going to pretend it's documenting YUI, and it'll say YUI and have the links. So there's some more stuff that needs to be listed there. This is, again, in that package I put up. You can check this out. All these values just get plugged into that script. Now, if you're like me and use something a little more complicated than a shell script, what happened here? Okay. Maybe use ant, slide title, slide content. I didn't do that. Someone else must have messed that up. There's a giant bear coming in here. Why is that? I really don't know how to process that. Wow. Oh, is it Halloween? No?
The gnome just walked by too.
Ah, well, no, that I'm not surprised. Gnomes I understand. Bears are a little weirder. So anyway, yes. Where was I? Okay. I use ant. It's easy to integrate YUI Doc into ant, and then put it right into your build. A couple of little things to watch out for when you're doing this in your build. Right now, if the temp directory that's being output by YUI Doc contains these files, they will be parsed, which can cause some weird issues. For example, if you copy your CVS directory from one directory to the other, the new directory thinks it's the old directory, and everything gets messed up. So Adam is aware of this. This is being worked on. But in the meantime, if everything goes crazy with your source control, this is what's happening. It doesn't care. It doesn't have a white. Basically, it doesn't have a don't look at these list. It doesn't have an ignore list. So, yeah. So keeping docs relevant. This is the big important thing, right? If your documentation, you've written beautiful documentation, it's perfect, and like I showed on that slide earlier, three bug fix releases later, and it has nothing to do with your code. And this is, you can still do this. Even it's a lot harder to do this if you're documenting inside your code and generating, but it's still it can happen. So there's some simple rules. First of all, generate documentation as part of the build. This is so critical. So you do a build. If you think that you can rely on someone to remember to generate the documentation later and put it up, they're not going to remember, and the builds are going to be out of sync with the docs. That's a big problem. Don't just have someone manually check documentation into version control system. In fact, why would you check your documentation into version control anyway if the documentation is being generated from the source? Unfortunately, at some companies, I won't mention any names, but they start with Y, we have a documentation system that requires us to check our documentation into source code. So the way I deal with this is my build checks my documentation into source control. I don't physically do it because when you introduce a human into this process, that's when things get out of sync. Like I said, better living through automation. And this is my favorite one. Treat documentation like code. If you're writing an API, and this is probably true of any kind of code, but APIs more than anything else, your documentation is part of your code. People are using your tool, and they count on documentation as much as they count on the actual code itself. If your documentation is out of sync, they can't use the API. They're just as unhappy as they would be as if there was a bug. So that's why I say, if you're doing code reviews, look at those doc comments. If your code is expecting an object and the doc comment says expecting a string, that's something to flag in a code review. Comments are source. Docs are compiled code. I think this is the easier way to think of. That's why I say don't check your docs into version control. You wouldn't check your binaries into source control. So your comments are the source code. That's what you need to be looking at. You should treat it like any other source code. You should review it. You should have it it's in CVS. And this is one of the cool things about doing it this way, is you've checked in your bug fix. You've updated your documentation. Someone can look at the diff later, and they can see the documentation change just as well as they can see the other changes. And what if it's broken? File a bug. It's code. It has a bug. The documentation is wrong. File a bug. Tell people to fix it. It's just, again, it's just as bad as any other bug, right? Because maybe your code works perfectly, but someone's going to try and call it. It's going to fail. To them, it's a bug. To you, it's, oh, well, I just didn't fix the documentation. To everyone else, it's a bug. So let's try it out real quick. I don't expect you to do this now, but I just wanted to cover this. I threw up an example on GitHub. When you download it, you're going to get this stuff. It's that same project I've been going through before. You can build it really easily, provided you have installed YUI Doc, and there's, in the earlier links, there's instructions on how to get it installed, or if you want to use Ant. So I've included sample build files, a shell script, and an XML, a build XML for Ant. It's pretty cool. And I'm using Fing in my build rather than Ant, but that's not by choice. It's the same idea, right? I have a build process. It does YUI compressor. It does all this other stuff, and it generates my documentation. It's just part of the process. I don't have to think too hard, and my docs are always there. And I also have a build clean that will remove all the docs. Because when you're done building, if you push your docs somewhere, you don't really need them anymore in the build directory. So YUI Doc has some other cool features. Let's say you don't like the beautiful, beautiful styles that we have, and you want to make them really wonderful and brown for some reason. It's really easy. Obviously, I'm not much of a designer, but I like brown for some reason. Anyway, I made mine brown. Easy to do. There's a style sheet there. I think it's incredibly simply laid out. We use YUI grids. The HTML is designed to use YUI grids. Customizing your template is generally as simple as editing the style sheet. But some of you are obsessive compulsive and want to have the perfect documentation layout. So we use a Cheetah template, which is a Python templating tool. If you've used Django, generally you've probably been exposed to this. And then you can get all fancy. Make it look however you want it to look. I'm not going to go into Cheetah, but look at our templates, look at the Cheetah website, and you'll see how powerful this is. You can really do whatever it is you want to do. Now, how about this? Custom everything. You're not happy enough changing your template. You're not happy with your custom template. You want to change the front end completely. Now, luckily, remember earlier I talked about those temp directories that we output when we were using the parser. We saw those set up. Those contain a JSON representation of the entire documentation. So if you want to write your own custom front end in whatever language you want, And actually, I just found out this morning someone has written an iPhone app that contains the YUI docs. Now, there's no reason you can't do this. It's a JSON structure. You can consume it. You know how to do that. So this is Dave Glass's Adobe Air app for the YUI docs. That output can be parsed by whoever wants to parse it. We don't have to worry about how we do it. So a little bit about that, just so we can get it straight. Remember back here, right? There's that parser out. That contains a complete representation. Everything that you see in the page is in that JSON structure. You can consume it and do whatever you want with it. I think this is actually one of the most powerful features of YUI Doc, because other documentation tools are really focused on the output, right? On the, OK, it makes HTML. This tool allows you to get in the middle of that and do whatever you want in the front end. Oh, yeah, cool bonus feature, code highlighting is in there. So if you just like code highlighting, you can steal that and use that yourself. I think that's cool. So I'm moving really fast for some reason. I must be. Let's talk about my parting wisdom. Documentation is part of the build. This is so critical. If you're not doing this, you're going to have pain. And I know this because I was not doing this until fairly recently. And my documentation was constantly out of sync. So people would say, Stephen, the docs say this and it doesn't work. And I'd be like, oh, yeah. I haven't generated the documentation. I'm really busy. I'm working on my presentation for YUIConf. So use tasks if you're using a build tool. I recommend you use a real build tool, by the way, and not a script, because they give you all these bonus features. And this is another idea that I like. I haven't been able to do it because I can't get the hardware to do it. But having a documentation server is really nice because there's someone that people can just point to. You can say the docs are always there. They can rely on the up-to-date documentation being in one place they can always go to. I find that to be the easiest way to handle this. Unfortunately, yeah, you have to beg someone to give you hardware to do it. So it's 12:15, and I'm sure you're all hungry, but hopefully you have some questions too. Questions? Yeah.
It worked pretty well. I mean, obviously there's language ambiguous, but do you have any examples for use of PHP?
I don't know if I have. I don't have an example of PHP.
Yeah, the PHP libraries, so the API docs is PHP. Oh, cool.
Okay, but everything. I mean, YUI. It's my favorite example of the language neutrality is the documentation for YUI Doc that can be generated out of Python. But
how would you compare it to PHP Documenter?
the huge difference is that it doesn't read it, right? So PHP Documenter does read the code, which has some real benefits, especially since PHP is a lot more faux static language. So you can have type hinting and things like that in formal classes. Reading the code and describing it in documentation is a lot easier because the idiom is a lot more clear on what's going to happen. So just reading code, generating docs works pretty well. The downside, and this is the upside downside of this, is that if you're using PHP Documenter, let me put up my information. If you're using PHP Documenter, you can get lazy, right? Because if you don't, it's always going to work. You know it's there. You don't have to update your comments. I think there's something to be said for having to have the discipline to make sure those comments really describe what's happening. If you get in the habit of, I changed this method, I need to change the docs. That's a good habit. So it's a bug and a feature, right? I mean, that's the big difference.
For you, do you guys update your docs just on every release?
I don't. They have it's built into the builder, the YUI builder tool. So I'm assuming they do. I work in a different group, so I don't know per se. But in my group, yes, on every single release, well, actually every single build. So and the other benefit is since if you have it in source code, you can actually just check out that snapshot and build docs for that snapshot. So you know that you can generate docs that are in sync with that moment. So when I do a release, I do a fork and subversion. And so every time I have a release, if I need to produce docs for that release, I know that I can always do it because it's just right there. Yep.
How do you format the C tag so that it creates a link to whatever other class you want it to go to?
The C tag?
Isn't there an C or SE tag?
Not that I'm aware of. There's extends, uses with.
And
There is, okay. Bart knows. What's the secret, Bart?
PHP doc?
Oh, in PHP Doc.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So there is, if you do things like extends and things like that, it automatically generates those links to the other classes or uses. Let me roll back here.
I guess the most common place I would use this tag is, for example, in the storage engine, there's an interface,
Mm-hmm.
and there's classes that extend that interface.
Right.
And I want to just point back to the interface where
Okay.
rather than have the same definition repeated.
I'll tell you how I do this. If I'm doing interfaces, and since interfaces don't exist in JavaScript, I will actually just write a comment-only file that contains interfaces. And I have done this before. So I write comments, describe the interfaces, and use a formal like I this, I that class, I foo. And then I say the next one extends I foo, and then YUI Doc will automatically generate that link. So that will do the job. Yep.
Are there any plans to make a standalone compiled version that doesn't require Python?
No, but it's on GitHub, and you can do it yourself.
No Python.
Again, and it is a little bit of, I would say it's a minor hassle to install. Once you have Python, you can use easy install from Python to get the little things that are required. But anyone who is a Python hacker is free to do that, because that would be pretty cool. But no, not right now. Further questions? No? Going once? Okay, well, this is, let me put me back my information. Again, I'm Stephen Woods. The person, Adam Moore, wrote this originally, and he's the real super expert. So, and he's available on the list in IRC and things like that. Also, please, if you want to bug me, I'm totally buggable. There's my bugging system.